last lecture in our public lecture series at Center of Informatics and Society, and I'm very glad that we have Astrid here. Astrid Mager. I printed out your CV from ITA, and I'm reading a little bit that you are informed what her background is. She's a scholar in science and technology studies with a particular interest in internet technologies and socio-political developments. Currently, you are working at Academy of Wissenschaften. This is, how is it called in English?
Austrian Academy of Sciences.
No, but this is ITA. What is this?
Oh,
Institute of Technology Assessment. Yes. So we have a lot of cooperations with it. We had a lot of cooperations with that group. So your research is concerned about with the internet and society, search engine politics, and policies. Today we are going to hear about the search engine design and algorithms and aspects of privacy, critical theory, and digital methods against the background of science and technology studies and technology assessment. So a rather critical view to the mechanisms, but you are going to inform us what the status quo is. I found out a lot of interesting visits to different countries. You were in France with Erasmus grant, then now you were in Amsterdam, and you had your PhD thesis on internet as a source of health information in 2010, and Ulrike Feck was your supervisor. So I think we have also a lot of health informatics studies in our previous institute. This is technology assessment. And this is also interesting to see, but unfortunately we will not hear about that today. So
yes, sorry for that.
So it's fine. So your experiences, I see virtually informed internet in the medical field. This is an FWF project. And then you were in Umea University for a while as postdoctoral fellow. Currently you are at the ITA, and you lead a project called Global Search. Probably you are mentioning or talking about.
That was the previous one.
The previous, and the next one is the algorithmic imaginary functions and values in the shaping of search engines. Elise Richter Fellowship we will hear about. And you have several publications, especially in social studies of science, new media and society, policy and internet, information communication and society. And yeah, we are very happy to have you here. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very kind and thorough introduction. I don't know, is the mic on? Should I use it?
You don't have to.
Yeah, I know. We'll turn it over. I'm pretty sure you will hear me anyway, right?
Yes.
So yeah, exactly. You mentioned my habilitation project already. That's actually what I'm going to talk about today. The overall title is Algorithmic Imaginaries, and it's an investigation of the making and governing of search engines in various socio-political contexts. Now I'm actually focusing most importantly on the European context. That's something that developed over the past years because I think there is a lot happening in Europe, both on the governance side and on the making side as well, and there is not so much research on that because it's either US-American research anyway, or it's on very specific cases like China and censorship and so forth. But the European cultural context in itself is something that is very interesting and very relevant at the moment. And if you think about the European data protection reform, but also various cases that have been brought by the European Court of Justice, for example, the right to be forgotten and so forth. So a lot has been happening in the past years, and I realized, well, that's actually a very interesting cultural context to focus on. So the overall habilitation project is actually consisting of 3 projects. So 2 of them have been mentioned already. The first one is well, after my PhD, I started to realize the search engine is very important, and so I thought I should be doing research on the search engine, and obviously I started out with the big universal search engines developed in Silicon Valley, and I was doing interviews with both developers but also people from the broader societal context like policymakers, legal experts and so forth. And I had a look at the way how these search engines are actually developed, what kind of visions, values, ideologies go into the making of these technologies. That's the project I did in UMIA. Later then, when I came back to Vienna and started working at the Institute of Technology Assessment, I was focusing on the European context more broadly, because I realized in the interviews there is kind of a tension between these US-American technologies sort of being imposed on our culture in a way, and legal structures, rules, regulations, and so forth. So that's also something that came out of the empirical material, actually. So in my second project, I was then focusing on the European data protection reform as sort of an arena where both technology is imagined, but also something like a European identity. So that's the second project. And the third one is a project on alternative search engines that are actually developed in Europe. And that's empirical work that I'm currently doing, so that's very much in the making, as you will see. And what I'm going to do today is to sort of bring these three projects together, and that's also what I'm trying to do in my habilitation project. Actually, I would like to do a book also and to see how these three different projects go together, and the sort of the broader frame is the imaginary frame. So it's always actually about different kinds of visions, values, cultural aspects, but also political, socio-political aspects that go into this governing and making of search engines and web. So to put it very, very briefly. So what I'm going to do now is I will sort of guide you through the first two projects rather briefly, and then focus more on the third one, because that's the actual one I'm working on right now. So when I started doing interviews and research on the development of universal big search engines, obviously they are constructed in a very specific cultural and political context. They are all, especially Google, developed in Silicon Valley. And Barbara and Cameron coined this notion of the Californian ideology, which is sort of this bizarre mixture between the hippies and the entrepreneurial yuppies that sort of came together and started to create this very specific cultural and also political context where a lot of technologies, not only search engines, but a lot of technologies, as you all know, are developed. But this is a very specific cultural context, very liberal data protection standards, for example, basically no regulation, and it's very driven by this very startup culture, if you would like to put it like this. But how is this actually shaping the way these technologies are developed? So there is this notion of the new spirit of capitalism I was working with. It's a book by Luc Boltanski and Yves Chapelot, and what they describe is that we have a new kind of capitalism around that actually incorporated a lot of the critique of the classical capitalism. So for example, the critique was like hierarchies, for example, or the alienation of your own work and things like that. So companies like Google are very good at sort of integrating this critique. If you think of Google as a company, it has these flat hierarchies, at least on a first sight. It also gives its employees 20% of their work time for their own projects in order to make them identify with the products much more, and so forth. And there is also this new kind of exploitation that is going on in a connectionist world, as they call it, a sort of creation of profit in very intransparent and opaque networks. When we think of the business models of these companies, for example, no one really knows how the profit is generated. Of course, we know there is data collected and that is transformed into profiles that are used to advertising clients, but in fact how it actually works is very non-transparent, and it's very opaque, and oftentimes users are part of all that without thinking about it, or also even without knowing about it. But at the same time, I was arguing that it's not enough to speak about the political economy of search engines, but that we should also have a look at the way, the way these power relations and dynamics and practices shape and stabilize the search engine in society as well. So it's not only the developers that were mentioned in the interviews, but it's also website providers and users, for example, that are very much part of this capital accumulation cycle, because the users feed their data into the search engine like day by day, if you're using the search engine, and also of course website providers have learned to adapt their practices towards their algorithms and the ranking mechanisms because they want to get found. So of course the Google search engine has become sort of an obligatory passage point for both the website content providers, also the marketers and the users. So they're all part of this, very essential part of this dynamic. And they all go through the search engine in order to reach their own goals. So they get visibility, they get to find their information, and at the same time they stabilize this whole dynamic. So we are all part of this mechanism, and also of course policy is part of it, having put search on the market in the first place, because there could have been state-funded projects or whatever right from the beginning. That's not what we have done. One interviewer said, for example, it's interesting that Europe also very much bought into this Americanized model of how things were organized. It's like a neoliberal model, actually. So it's important to look at these practices, and at the same time, the technology fosters this new kind of spirit of capitalism in being used also. So by using the search engine, we at the same time stabilize this mechanism like day by day. So it's really this entanglement of technical features and individual practices and financial transactions that is happening during every Google search. In fact, every search query brings all these aspects together. So the ideology, we can say, is in the search engine itself already. It's built into the search engine. It acts through the technology at the same time. So it's really this co-production between technology and social practices. So what I was then actually concluding is that we also need to shift the perspective from the political economy of search engines or the impacts these search engines have on society towards the way, towards looking at the practices actually that stabilize the search engine over and over again, and that also sort of shapes the search engine like all the time, basically. So one way of, so the question of course now is, what about Europe? And one way of looking at all this is, or at the sort of changing the perspective, is to look at Europe also as a place where both search technology is governed and shaped at the same time, but also where a European identity is imagined at the same time. So if you would like to see how search engines are governed and shaped, we could then have a look at the European data protection reform, for example. That was something that was announced 2010 for the first time. That's when my second project started, so I realized, wow, that's going to be really an interesting case, actually, to look at the way search technology is also framed and regulated and governed in this very specific European context. So because when I wrote the application for the project, I was sort of describing it as this tension between US-American technology and very local cultures, but then I realized the European level is a very important level where a lot of things are happening right now. So as I said, I framed this data protection reform as kind of an arena where different actors get to speak, and also where discourses, of course, are shaped, and where Europe is finding its own identity in regard to these big technology companies. So the negotiations are rather long, as most of you know, most probably. They ran from 2012 till 2015. And my analysis started in 2010, because that was the first time when criticism was also raised in public debates. For example, if you think about the Google Street View debate, that was really the first time when people started to speak out. There was this one farmer, for example, that attacked the Google car with a pig's egg, and that was sort of this iconic image the media transported about sort of Europe is speaking, or Austria more specifically, sort of fighting against these cars that are overruling our country, and the media made a big thing out of it. But it was actually really the first time that privacy and data protection and things like that became more mainstream, more debated in the mainstream also. And at the same time, on a policy level, this European data protection reform was announced as a tool to sort of bring these companies into European law, so to say. So 2010, I thought, is a good starting point for this kind of analysis. I analyzed both European policy documents and also Austrian media debates, because I also wanted to see how these European debates get translated into the Austrian context, or also vice versa. And I stopped with this analysis in May 2014. because I was running out of time and the negotiations took much, much longer than everyone expected. There was so much lobbying and so, yeah, a lot of amendments, more than ever in European legislation history. And I thought May 2014 is a good point in time to end this analysis, because it was when the European Parliament was elected and this whole reform process came to a halt for a particular moment, and everyone actually was very much disappointed that they didn't reach a final, or didn't manage to conclude this European data protection standards before this election process. So this was kind of a defeat. Also, that's the way it was presented in the media at least. So in fact, it took one more year until 2015 that they really reached a common sense and all parties agreed on this new legislation process. So first of all, the question, well, theoretically, I was then working with this concept of the socio-technical imaginary. For SDS people, that's a very common concept now. I will briefly explain it. So the idea here is that nations or countries sort of imagine technology, and at the same time, while imagining and also governing whatever technology, they also imagine nationhood and their own identity in a way. It's a concept that has been developed by Sheila Chesanoff and Kim, and they usually do a comparative analysis between different countries to see how atomic energy or whatever is sort of imagined in South Korea or in the US, for example. So they do these country comparisons usually. So for me, I thought it's a very useful tool, because that's exactly what I would like to analyze, these visions and imaginaries and the way policymakers, European policy is imagining search technology, and of course related technologies like social media and so forth. That's not very much differentiated oftentimes in policy documents. And also something like a European identity. So just a quote, to give you a quote from this concept. Socio-technical imaginaries are collectively imagined forms of social life and social order reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific and or technological projects. And at the same time, they argue it's also that the state or the nationhood is reimagined in this process. So both is not fixed. It's neither the technology nor the political order that's fixed, but it's also getting reperformed in the projection, production, implementation, and uptake of socio-technical imaginaries. So I was then, through this lens, I was then analyzing European policy documents and Austrian media debates, and of course, it quickly emerged this kind of European search engine imaginary where fundamental rights were described, they're framed as very core European values, and especially the European, whether the data protection, the fundamental right to data protection was very much framed as this core European value in contrast to US-American cultural technology companies. So they really describe Europe as this guardian of citizens' personal data, and at the same time they also wanted to be a driving force in promoting high data protection standards worldwide. And this is also something that we still have in the debate, that we could be a role model in terms of data protection sort of on a global scale. So there is definitely this kind of European search engine imaginary emerging in the European policy discourse. It's also picked up and reinforced in Austrian media debates, because it very well also fits our own technology policy. So Austria has been described as having a rather restrained technology policy. So we are very reluctant, for example, in comparison to, or in regard to genetically modified foods, for example, or nuclear technologies. So this sort of fits our own political identity very well. So Austrian media debates were also very much supporting this kind of European vision, and then we were seeing ourselves very much as part of this. And in this whole discourse, Europe is characterized as this coherent entity, as sort of this whole with our European values. But what kind of politics is actually imagined in these discourses? It's kind of a politics of control, as I coined it. It's very much about control and containing these big technology companies. It's not so much about creating our own IT policy. It's rather how can we handle these companies, how can we bring them into our legislation, how can we limit their business models. And this could be seen on multiple levels. So users, for example, should have more control over their personal data. That has been coming out of this European barometer surveys where people say, I don't feel I'm in control of my data, quite the contrary. Also, data protection agencies are imagined to control these technology companies better, even though that's a huge controversy because oftentimes, especially in Austria, they don't have enough resources and technical know-how to actually do so, and then policymakers would need to give them more resources, which is not happening. So the question is there also, well, how honest they are oftentimes when it comes to the actual practices. But in fact, in the European policy documents, data protection agencies are very much imagined as controlling these companies. And then Europe in itself is kind of imagined as regaining control over these things that have apparently being gotten out of control in a way. So the business models, the data flows, the algorithms, the financial transactions, tax, and so forth. So the feeling was very much that we need to regain control in a way. When looking at the institutionalization of the discourse, though, sort of the translation of the discourse into the actual legal documents, we can see that there is, of course, a lot of controversy. It's not that Europe appears to be this united whole, quite on the contrary, especially in the media, there were a lot of reports about Great Britain and Ireland and also Sweden, like companies, or especially also Ireland, where these companies also have their European homes in a way. It's not that they are far away, they are also having their homes in Europe itself. So these countries are very much contrasted to Germany and Austria and also Poland, previously Eastern countries that were fighting very much for strong European data standards, data protection standards, whereas these other countries were actually fighting for less strict data protection standards. So people and countries were coming from different levels of data protections already, and of course there were tough negotiations and also compromises to be made, and that's also the reason why everything took so long, because it was very hard to reach this common sense. So this European heterogeneity very much complicated these negotiations of the common data protection standards, and of course that goes back to historic events. If we think about national socialism or communism, countries with this history have a very different perception of privacy and data protection than the UK, for example. And of course we have very different economic cultures, cultural settings, social context, and so forth. So Europe is very far away from being this united whole, as we can see now in the newspaper every day. Great Britain is even about to exit Europe. So there is nothing like this imagined Europe with its European values, but it's rather like a multiply imagined community that has very different meanings to different actors and countries and people. Nevertheless, the question is why there is so much control in the focus of this whole policy, and why there is not so much imagination of a politics of innovation. So how can we actually make use of these data protection standards now, especially in Europe? So of course there is this talk about privacy by design that is also part of the European data protection legislation now, but it remains very vague to me. So there is not much, it's hard for me to imagine to actually build privacy in a technology if you're not actually creating this technology. So how would I force US American companies to build this into their technologies? So we would need to have our own infrastructure then maybe. And then of course data protection could become something like a business advantage at the same time. So especially for European startups, it could be used as an advantage, but there is not so much in the debate about that. It's rather at the margins of the debate. It's in the startup culture, and also NGOs talk about that, but not very much in the mainstream. So I ended up with the question, how can these European values then also actually build into technology? And that led me to my current research project, actually, where I'm looking at search engines based in Europe, being developed in Europe, and also trying to offer some kind of alternative style of search. So a real technical alternative to these universal search engines. And I'm working with three particular case studies, and all of them could be summarized as social innovation in a way. So the Young Foundation, which is an NGO supporting social innovation, describes social innovation as something that refers to innovative activities and services that are motivated by the goal of meeting a social need and that are predominantly diffused through organizations whose primary purposes are social compared to profit gain, so to say. So who are these case studies? So how long am I expected to talk actually?
Yeah, 25 minutes.
So the first one is Startpage. This is the most well-known, most probably from my 3 case studies. It's actually, it's a company as well. It's a Dutch company and it has a cooperation with Google. So what it actually offers users is to search the Google index, so to say, without transmitting personal data. So it was previously known as XQuick, which was a meta search engine that integrated search results from very different search engines. They ended with XQuick, they ended this project, but they still use this XQuick technology, as they call it, and they have now this partnership with Google, which is actually quite good because that's what users ultimately want. They want to use Google, and at the same time they can protect their privacy. So what they get is the Google search results, not all of them, they just get this partner index, which is way enough anyway, thousands of results. But it's not personalized. So there is no transmittance of your personal data, which means also the search engine is not giving you the personalized search results, but it has its own ranking instruments, but it just uses the search results. And at the same time, it's different results, of course, because Google always integrates your personal data and your IP address and so forth and localizes your search, which is Startpage not doing. At the same time, of course, we can see, and I come to these constraints, at the same time it's totally dependent on Google, of course. It does not have its own technology, it's rather a sort of an add-on on the search engine Google. So the more radical idea is this Open Web Index, which is a group of people around Dick Lewandowski, who is a quite well-known search engine researcher. And this group of people has the idea that we need an open web index, that we need our own infrastructure actually in Europe, and that we should build our own infrastructure. And it should ideally be funded by the European Union, because they think we need public infrastructure. It should not all these indexes, search engine indexes that are rather comprehensive are owned by companies. It's actually just 4 or 5. It's just Bing and Google and also Yandex and Baidu are owned by companies. So there is no open index. So no one can work with it. No programmer can build things on top of it. So their idea would actually be that we need to fund a public index like we funded libraries in the past. And we also took money into our hands to give people education and access to knowledge for free in a way. So they think in the search engine, in the internet age, a search engine actually does exactly that. It offers, it gives you access to information and knowledge, and it should be open, and then different kinds of programmers could build different kinds of ranking mechanisms, search algorithms, whatever. And it could also have, we could also then have like a landscape of search engines. They are imagining that we don't need this one size fits all model, but rather that for librarians or for whatever investigative journalists, there could be different informational needs. So why should one search engine provide like everything? So if we would have this open web index and it would be comprehensive and it would be nicely maintained, which would cost a lot of money, of course, then we could have a much more diverse search engine landscape. And they are trying to sort of convince European policymakers at the same time of this project, and they're trying to get money. This is something that is rather at the beginning, since a couple of years now, but it's not so easy to get a lot of money from the European Union. The third case study is Yassi. That's the most radical from a technology point of view. I would say it's a peer-to-peer search engine. So what they do is they don't have this central index, but it's rather decentralized, and it runs on the machines of users. And with this Yassi proxy, you can then sort of index your own websites, and you can share it with the peers, and that's the way the index is built. So it's rather built from the bottom instead of top down. And there could also be intranet solutions and all of that. At the same time, these same people are working on a virtual assistant now, which is kind of interesting because search in itself is changing, of course. So they are thinking the conversational web is becoming more and more important, so we more and more get used to talk to our devices. So if we think of Google Home and all that, so that's what they are trying to do. They are trying to do an open source, Alexa, Google Home, whatever, because they're thinking it should be an open source alternative. And that's the way search is going to be developing anyway. So the YASI project is sort of, not so much work on right now, even though there are still developers also developing this project further, but their own motivation is going into this SUSI AI, as they call it, this virtual speech, or whatever it's called, virtual assistant in English. So this is kind of a case study that has developed into yet another case study. And what are my research questions? So when you remember, in both my first and my second research projects, the question was always what kind of visions and values and imaginaries and ideologies go into the shaping of these technologies and also into the governing of these technologies. So once again, I'm asking here what actually these motivations are, what are the value systems, what are the visions that guide the development of these European search engines. And at the same time, I'm trying to look at the practices more deeply with this project, and I'm really trying to get at the way these imaginations are getting translated into the technologies or in these kinds of socio-technical design practices. Of course, what kind of negotiations, compromises, and power dynamics may be observed. And also, since I'm interested in this European context, also how place and the cultural context matter in the development of search engines. What are the methods? It's actually an ethnographic approach, if we would like to call it like this. So it's a combination of different methods. It's both on-site visits, also short ethnographies, oftentimes from a distance. I'm participating in conference calls, for example. Then with the open source project, there's this GitHub platform, so there's plenty of material to analyze. Then, of course, I'm doing interviews with all these search engine developer teams. The more, the better. I'm taking everything what I get from them, basically. And I'm also doing these mind scripting workshops that Royce Alhuter developed. And mind scripting is an interesting method because it works with memories. So the developer teams are invited to think about the crucial decisions they had to make in the past about their project. So something critical, if they had a crisis, how they managed the crisis, or also a breakthrough, whatever is important for these people. So even the sort of the situation that is analyzed comes out of the group. So it's a participatory method, actually. And once these people decide on this one particular decision they had to make, they have to write a short piece of text about this decision, how they remember it. So it's kind of a diary entry, actually. It should not be overthought or anything. It should not be edited a lot of times. It should rather be like written quickly and like a diary entry. And during the workshop, then, we are discussing and deconstructing these texts with them. So again, everyone actually participates in the interpretation of the texts as well. And it's surprisingly interesting because you really get at these practices in a way through these discussions of the text, and we really have this guideline, like how is the author describing him or herself in the text? Is it a rather passive or active perception of oneself? How are other people described in the text? And then, of course, how are actions and decisions described? How is it described how they reach a decision and things like that? So the idea is that you really get sort of deeper in terms of values that influence all these decisions without being maybe so easy to explicate in an interview. So oftentimes it's not easy if someone asks you what are the values that guide their work. It's not something that you can easily say, but during these discussions, things like also perceptions of the user, for example, come to the fore simply through the deconstruction of the text. So it's a very linguistic method, actually. And it should also be kind of an intervention for the developer teams themselves. So they should also have these aha moments where they realize, interesting, I've never thought about that, but apparently that's a pattern in our team. So it describes it like this. Mind scripting can be applied to trace how designers interconnect their professional know-how with practical ways of problem solving that are co-shaped by societal discourses. And originally I planned to do these mind scripting workshops with all of the developer teams, but that's something that seems to be challenging, to put it nicely. So I did one of these mind scripting workshops with the Open Web Index people. They were very open to that, and we found a good point in time to do that. And the problem with the other developer teams, though, especially the open source people, is that they do not sit in the same place. So they are totally gathered all over the place. So some of them are in Berlin and Frankfurt in Germany. Others are in India. They're working with Google Summer of Code now. So that's a program that Google has to support open source development. So these people are sitting everywhere, and it's not so easy to bring them to one place to do these mind scripting workshops. So that's one challenge. And the other challenge is that these people are not very open to lengthy reflections of hours and hours, because they just want to do stuff. And when they meet, so they also go to these open tech summits where they actually meet, or at least parts of them, but then they want to work together and code the technology. It's not that they want to sit there with me and reflect about their practices, because these mind scripting workshops are pretty time consuming, because you would need like half a day or even more for such a workshop. So for them it's a really long time, and once they are together they want to just work together. So I'm thinking about how to gather their practice, and most probably I will participate in their developer sessions during an open tech summit or something like that. Actually there's one in Singapore in March, which seems very tempting to me. But I don't think I can do the mind scripting in this very classical sense. So maybe for all of these projects I need a different set of methods also. Because with the Startpage people, that's a company again. So that's yet another set of questions that is coming up there. And I'm not sure how close I will get to their actual practices, because they have like PR agencies that are also like sort of closing me off a little bit now. But we will see. And then I will do also interviews with search engine developers from other cultural contexts. Asia, I think, is very interesting, but maybe also the US with DuckDuckGo, for example, or something like that. So, as I said, I'm in the middle of the field work right now, so it's not a thorough analysis I'm going to present now, but it's just to give you some first glimpses into the material and see where the issues are. So what are these visions and values driving Startpage, for example? Of course, it's very obvious. They are trying to provide users with data protection, so they actually try to make this fundamental right to data protection enforceable in practice, because that's what users need. Because so many users say, well, I'm very concerned about my privacy, but still they're using these technologies day by day, oftentimes because there is no alternative, or they don't know about it. So they try to provide an alternative in this sense. On a more theoretical level, one could also say that they are also fighting against this sort of Silicon Valley rhetoric of privacy as anti-innovation. Julie Cohen has written about that in a very interesting way, because she argues that privacy has an image problem. And I quote now, over and over again, regardless of the forum in which it is debated, it is cast as old-fashioned at best and downright harmful at worst, anti-progressive, overly costly, and inimical to the welfare of the body politic. So she's actually arguing that this is part of the Silicon Valley rhetoric already that has sort of globalized, and now we are thinking about privacy the same way oftentimes, but in fact it's quite the opposite. Freedom from surveillance, whether public or private, is foundational to the practice of informed and reflective citizenship. So privacy, therefore, is an indispensable structural feature of liberal democratic political systems. So this project, in this sense, also tries to provide an alternative to this, what Julie Cohen coins the surveillance innovation complex, that brings the argument forth that surveillance is actually an integral part of innovation. You cannot innovate without surveillance, because we need all the user data to improve our technologies and so forth. So they are trying to sort of act against this rhetoric at the same time. The Open Web Index people much more build their visions and values on this kind of idea of a state-funded European web index. They say very much should not be a state-run search engine, but still the funding should be public, and they are trying to diversify corporate search engine landscapes. it could also be seen in the tradition of providing a kind of public service alternative to Google with its quasi-monopoly. So Iosifidis says that the internet creates, it is said that the internet creates a new public sphere for political intervention, thus expanding the realm for democratic participation. So in this sense, there is a continued need for strong, well-funded public institutions capable of delivering socially valuable content that would keep public debate alive. So in a sense, this project also tries to develop this kind of public European web index and enabling free access to information in the tradition of libraries and so forth. The YASI project could be seen as providing open infrastructure. They're fighting for open infrastructure. They're developing open infrastructure for with this peer-to-peer search engine, but also with the virtual assistant. And it should be a technology that is built by users and also for users. They are trying to offer free access to knowledge, but also free access to the code and the information and the infrastructure. So this could be seen in the tradition of Joachim Benkler, for example. The salient characteristic of commons as opposed to property is that no single person has exclusive control over the use and disposition of any particular resource in the commons. So it's kind of this tradition of an ideology of the commons-based peer production. So when it comes to the challenges and compromises and coalitions, we can already see, even like on a very first sight, that there are, of course, all these projects have to do compromises, and they also have to enter coalitions in various ways. So Startpage is, of course, the most successful project, but it's, as I said before, it's totally dependent on Google, and if Google ends the cooperation, they have no technology, they have no index, they have nothing. And Google ended cooperations like this in the past. When we think about all these ecological search engines that also used the Google index before, and now Google apparently just ended these cooperations and they're working with Bing now. But still, it's very much a dependency actually. So if the cooperation fails, the search engine in itself fails, because it lacks its own index. So it's rather a shallow project actually that draws very much on the infrastructure that's there, on the corporate infrastructure. The Open Web Index has the problem that it's not so easy to acquire these millions of euros from the European Union, and the problem there is that also the history does not help very much, because maybe some of you remember the project that was called Quero, and later it was called Theseus, and it was actually meant to develop this huge European search engine, but it's not that something like a European search engine came out of that. It's rather a project that got separated in a German project and a French project, and the German project developed semantic technologies, and they are still doing that, but it's not that the kind of a European Google was emerging out of that. And the French part is working on multimedia search more, and in the press it was actually presented like a defeat at the same time. So policymakers also still have that in mind and say, well, that's something we tried already, right? Did not work out. So yeah. So they have the idea now to maybe start from the bottom and start to work with data centers and start to connect data centers and use the resources that are there already, and that they would also then build the index from below, not from the top down with this huge investment, but rather using resources that are there. But at the same time, parts of the group say, well, will it ever become a comprehensive web index, or will it yet again be a search engine that has a crawler and a small index, but no one can actually use it because it's not comprehensive enough, because there are so many of these search engines around. Another idea would be to cooperate with industry partners, for example, even though that actually goes against one of their ideals, which would be this publicly funded search engine. So there is a compromise to be made there as well. And YASI also, of course, has the issue that, of course, oftentimes a lot of developers are contributing, but oftentimes also no one is contributing. So if you have this open source project, it's not that you can really rely on these developers so much. And so they started with the SUSI AI project, they started also to make use of this Google Summer of Code program, where they get people to work on their open source projects where we can really draw on them, where we can really work with them. They get a lot of money, or a lot of, they get money from Google, so these people are sort of doing this during their summertime, and they get money, and they contribute to the open source project. At the same time, I would argue it's rather troubling that Google yet again funds these alternatives actually that try to provide something else. So again, there is a compromise there to be made, also to become or to remain capable to act. And we can see that there are coalitions with also hegemonic actors like Google and very strong existing power relations actually. So to sum up, and that's something I have not so many answers yet to, but it's rather something I would like to throw out for the discussion maybe. What are the implications of that in terms of social innovation then? If and how can social innovations, be they local or European, actually scale up? If they have no index, if they lack money, if they lack peers and so forth. And Malgen again from this Young Foundation organization argues that in the past governments have often played a critical role in scaling up social innovations, but social innovations generally find governments unresponsive and public bodies usually move too slowly for impatient entrepreneurs and activists. That's also something the open source community communicated very straightforward to me, that this is way too bureaucratic, that's not the way they work, they just want to start and do stuff and they don't want to write like thousands of pages of reports. So the funding structures are problematic, especially in Europe as it seems. So what this Malgen guy argues that social Silicon Valleys are actually needed to describe the future places and institutions that will mobilize resources and energies to tackle social problems in ways that are comparable to the investments in technology made in the first Silicon Valley and its equivalents around the world. But until then, which will also take some time, most probably, the question is, should these alternatives find then their niche within the more hegemonic framework that is around, for example, by forming coalitions with corporate actors, Google in this case, and if and how then social innovations under these conditions can then unfold transformative power at all in terms of overcoming dominant power relations or reaching something like social change, what they are actually fighting for. Or will they sort of remain in their little niches and will be used by a couple of users and that's enough? So that is actually the question I would like to end with here and also throw it out into the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Sure. Well, any answers?
Yeah, please tell me. I will write them up.
Or, of course, further questions?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Have you heard of the German company Clicked?
Clicked, no?
Yeah, it's a company who now owns the Ghostery ad blocker.
Okay.
You might know that.
Yeah.
And which company is itself owned by at least a part of the Mozilla Foundation, and they're trying to develop a search engine which is also built on privacy by design, by doing all those personalizations on the local machine, and just getting the, I don't know if I'm remembering it correctly, but I think they're getting some kind of indexes or sending keywords in some way to the server, some broad fields where about which information the user is searching for, and they do the fine-grained searching on the local device, something like that.
And is it a meta search engine or?
No, I think actually they are building their own infrastructure, if I remember correctly. Also partnering with, since they own the Ghostery ad blocker, and Ghostery itself also tracks information for that company. So I think they're in some way getting information from there, but I'm not totally sure. It's been just a while since I've read about that.
Because there are a lot of these projects that are trying to build their own indexes now. The only problem is that they are way too small. That's why no one is using them, and it would take so many resources and also time. If you think about the whole web nowadays, I mean, Google also grew with the web in a way. It was way smaller when they started out. Now it's a huge, accumulation of websites. So these projects that are having their own crawlers and that are trying to build this index oftentimes fail simply because it's not big enough, and therefore it's not interesting to users. It's not. I don't know this project, and I'm not saying that it's correct, but still that is a problem that I realize with many of these alternatives that are actually trying to build their own indexes. That's why these open web index people say we need a huge investment to be able to do that in a comparative way to these universal corporate search engines that users are used to.
Maybe it would be an idea if they start out using corporations with bigger search engines while they are starting building their own infrastructure, and they're getting money through the corporations or through the users and using the corporations. But I think the end goal should be to build their own infrastructure.
I think that's what DuckDuckGo is doing.
Yeah,
they have this
yeah.
crawler and they're using, at the moment it's a meta search engine still.
DuckDuckGo is still a meta search engine. Oh, I didn't know that.
It's both. They have this crawler, but still it's not comprehensive enough, so they draw on other sources.
I thought I was curious about DuckDuckGo as a comparison, since you mentioned it as a firmly entrenched in U.S. American culture, and that's where they stem from. And when you describe the kind of the values and the imagineers that happen in Europe as a contradiction towards the U.S. spirit, where does that happen with DuckDuckGo? Like,
I would like to talk to them as well. Yeah, I didn't want to make them a case study because then it's yet another U.S. American. But you're right. I should not. I mean, it's important to not fall into this trap of saying European is better per se. That's something I really have to avoid. Yeah. But still, I find it interesting when people think about alternatives, they only think about DuckDuckGo. So is the marketing so much better?
That's
really
what I think,
feasible
actually.
question. Yeah.
Because when you mentioned it, I was trying to, also in preparation for the talk, I was trying to research some of the other options that you're mentioning, and I consistently saw ads for DuckDuckGo that came up, which to me was very surprising. As someone who's sort of kind of privacy conscious, a company that goes out and says we're doing privacy by design, that is advertising so massively, something feels fishy about that. But I keep wondering if that's not maybe a European approach as well, in a way.
I think they just have more money compared to the European alternatives. I don't know. I mean, the Startpage people actually complain very much about the fact that also in the media it's mostly these big tech companies that are mentioned. So the media does not talk very much about alternatives. That's something they really try to enforce, and they really spam these newspapers with their Pressemitteilungen, but still they don't find so much response. That's part of the problem as well. So that yet again stabilizes these big companies. It's not only policy, it's also media and so forth. I mean, we read all these new Apple products every day. We don't read so much about alternatives, and if we do, it's DuckDuckGo, interestingly. Yeah. I don't know why that is.
I think one of the reasons. I'm sorry.
You were talking about privacy as a central element in your reflections, and then you were putting that in perspective to search engines. Are search engines really the biggest issue here? Are the social media or Internet of Things where you have sensors all over the place, or like in the UK where you have cameras all over the place? This is nothing about search engines. It's about data gathering, and do you think that the search engines are the biggest issue here, or why did you restrict yourself to this part?
Well, the restriction was there before. So I'm doing research on search engines now with the habilitation project because I have these two comparative projects already. So my focus is clearly on search engines, but of course it's not limited to that. On the other hand, Google is one of the biggest AI developers, one of the biggest Google self-driving car developers. So it's not Google as a search engine anymore. So Google is a huge tech company being big in all these new innovative data gathering areas, smart home and so forth. It bought the smart metering company a couple of years back. So Google is way more than a search engine right now. And this all goes together, that they combine the data from all their different services. And it's not only the Google search, it's the Google Mail, it's even on the web, it's YouTube, it's all these different kinds of informational spaces they can draw on to gather their data, but of course it goes into the real world. But yet again, it's again these 5 companies that have these AI technologies being developed, and Europe again tries to argue we want to have all these AI technologies, and I'm just thinking, well, they are way ahead already again. Where is our AI technology? We don't have any, right? Or do we? Do you know about that? It's always these 4 or 5 companies, and of course social media are privacy, raising privacy issues too. The other thing though I think is with the search engine, people don't think about that so much, because if you really make an account with a social media platform, you at least do tick this box of terms of services, and you sort of realize that you are participating in a particular space. Now with the search engine you never do that. Oftentimes, of course, you are also logged into your Google account, and that's yet again a good way of getting all your data and integrating it with your personal, very private data, mobile phone numbers and so forth. But if you only use the search engine, you wouldn't think that so much data is collected maybe. But only the search terms say so many things about you. There was this experiment, it's like 5 or 7 years ago now, with the AOL search engine, where they released 3 months of search data. And it was so easy to connect only the search terms to the real people, because if you use this search engine all the time, it knows more about you than your therapist maybe. So I think the search engine is still interesting though in this regard, even though it's not the only challenging thing.
There is this sentence? No.
The same?
The French Data Protection Agency just released a statement today that Google collecting data without the explicit consent while using the search engine is actually a GDPR violation. So
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting
just came out today because of a claim brought in by Max Schrems and his NGO.
And why?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, the French Data Protection Agency is very active in general.
Well, look at that.
Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting, but I'm wondering, you explained already that you're focusing on the search engines, and the index seems to be still at the center of all these efforts, basically.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if that's not actually an old-fashioned technological challenge, because the index is certainly at the core of all these search engines, but as you mentioned, Google is so much more than that. And isn't it actually isn't the privacy violation kind of what brings the success somewhat, and like the actual user experience that many people appreciate so much? So isn't the real gain coming from all these things that we don't really like there? And so just focusing on index building is actually is too close or too narrow of a problem here. When actually the question is recommendation in the sense of like who's the user and what are the things that are happening here.
Well, that's such an interesting question. I was thinking about that too. And on the other hand, I'm thinking maybe that's just what we got used to. I mean, is it really something that we want, or is it just something that we got used to with Amazon and all these recommendations all the time? So is it really required? I mean, that the companies always say, well, we need the data to optimize the algorithm, and of course they need the data to make a lot of money also. And of course they also use it to personalize stuff. And of course it makes sense if I look for a restaurant that it's around the corner and not somewhere in some other countries. But these are things that you can also sort of localize yourself with the, So the question, but it's much more effort than for the user.
Exactly. I think, you can do that yourself, but I think this is exactly the point where maybe people with a better understanding of how technology works, they can easily formulate a query that fits their needs. But helping other people, and this is where the broad success comes from, is actually taking that effort away from them.
But what would be then the conclusion of that? And then the conclusion just simply would be we need to get along with it. And like Mark Zuckerberg says, privacy is from the past.
Right.
Is it?
I-
I mean,
I
that's
do-
a troubling question.
I do think that maybe if you take a little closer look at the technology involved, it is thoroughly possible to have personalized search results without the actual privacy infringement. You don't need to necessarily keep the stuff, because what you want is the correlation. What you don't need is to keep it for longer, with one exception. If you want to deliver personalized ads, then you need to be able to relate it back to the person. But if you can that part of it, then it's thoroughly possible to do this kind of personalization without the privacy infringement as well. But then, of course, to disentangle ad revenue as a business model from the rest is utopian to think for Google, at least.
And what would be an alternative business
And
model?
exactly.
Would people pay for that? Would people be willing to pay for something that has been free for the past years?
But perhaps that's the
Centuries?
reasoning behind the projects that are looking to secure public funding for that. Yeah. One more, or
No, do you
Thank
want
you.
it?
Yeah. I just want to disagree, actually, because I don't think that personalized search is, in some cases it is better, but in also many cases it is not better. Personalizing things is great when you have a news feed and you want relevant information, but you don't have some kind of search query. But I've talked about this recently with a few friends of mine, where we talked about, okay, when we listen to music on YouTube, and we were usually just typing in some band, and when you do the play, or when you say automatic play, and YouTube selects the next video, then usually a few years ago it was just all the songs from this band, but now it comes up if I have watched Disney movies or clips from Disney movies for 2 hours previously, then it will be Disney movies again. But that's not the case what I want now, and that's also the same for search engines. When I want to buy a new washing machine, and I do a thorough investigation and research what are the best washing machine at the moment, and then I buy it. I don't want to be bothered again with washing machines for the next 2 months.
Already, right?
And also, it might be the case, because I have done research on the programming language Python before, but it might be the case that I want to find some more about the snake Python, and I won't get any results for that, and I will explicitly have to state that. And I think it is actually possible, and I think also people don't it's not that much of an effort. Just if you want to search for restaurants locally, that you put your location in there, or maybe you put just Vienna, or maybe if I'm searching for restaurants in Vienna all the time, and next time in Paris, and it just personalized to Vienna, and I won't again find no restaurants. So I'm really wondering how much value is there in personalizing everything, actually.
And also, actually, there are studies saying that search engines do not so much personalize with all the filter bubbles, talk and so forth.
Yeah.
It's not so different. So in fact, it's slight personalization apparently. So it's not.
It's to do with the such a huge response time.
well, it's,
I think the same thing goes for personalized ads, right? Because they are so wrong so often that it would be better to just not do the personalization. So just, I mean, newspapers in print, they also only have rough demographics on, and
exactly.
a rough idea about who they can target with their ads. So I guess it should be enough to do the same thing online.
And there was this one journalist I talked to, and he said really important things I never thought about, but he actually said companies don't even know their potential users so well. I mean, they don't even have this clear imagination of this one person that should be using their technology. It's roughly, it's more women or more, so it's exactly this demographics actually they have in mind. They don't want to target it so specifically to
25-year-old located in
Yeah.
the 7th district.
So that's also something, but there is so much rhetoric that is actually coined by these companies themselves, so that they made us think that this is actually the case, that we need all this data just to do advertising, but also this is totally nonsense, yeah.
So I was wondering, so I think search engines are very powerful, for obvious reasons, and you also showed us privacy issues or impact afterwards, or whatever you find, where you find, and what you buy, etc. But did you study or did you systematically analyze the role of search engines in so economic area or political area or something with local and global and this type, or with the people, with interaction of the machines, or who searches it, which and find something, what does it mean actually? Is it something that we make up a big deal, or is it something that has a big impact in our lives? So as you gave some examples, searching for restaurants or searching for information or searching for wash machines, etc. So I think, I need actually a little bit more about what is the role and why are we bothering? Why is it so important? And why are we running behind the Google and behind all the things? If we have obviously certain mechanisms like policies, we put some protection rules, etc. We can stop certain things, at least. We try to stop, so I don't know. So, I mean, if we cannot use it, or if we use, but we cannot use it in the social interaction, so we cannot use it as an evidence or use it as something which is legal. So, what are the different elements that should be considered in order to keep something under control, or enable it, or disable it, or so? Maybe Europe has more dispositions, or reflecting on the things, how they are used by whom, offered by whom, and which is important, which is not important. Instead of saying the French people do something and the I don't know, the German do another thing, or everyone is against Google, or Asia, for instance, what they do, how they communicate. So this would be very interesting. Are there studies about that, or are we also thinking in general terms and looking into the single cases, or what is your planning or habilitation?
Well, the user experience was my starting point, right? That was something that I did in my PhD actually. So in my PhD, as part of this FWF project, we had done search experiments with people. So we invited people to look for, we gave them a particular diagnosis. It was diabetes and 3 other chronic diseases. So one person would, for example, get this diabetes diagnosis, and then we said, well, just look for information now, where would you go? So, and then we captured the screen, and we did also interviews after that, how they think the quality of the websites were, how they perceived the information they found, and things like that. So we compare sort of the screen, what they actually, their practices, with the perception and the evaluation of their own searches. And obviously, even back then, and that's more than 10 years ago now, almost everyone used Google right away. And then they started typing and stuff. And in my PhD, I was actually then, on top of that, doing interviews with providers of websites, also from the health-related context, like from the portal, from the commercial health portal, NetDoctor, to very small diabetes NGOs, so to say. So I had a range of very different actors. And then in my PhD, I was conceptualizing the search engines sort of as the mediator between the providers and the users, because the providers wanted to gain visibility, of course, and the more commercial ones also use professional search engine optimization, and the NGO said, well, I don't care, I just want to put out the information, and whoever will find it is fine. And the users, on the other hand, use the search engine, of course, to find their way through the information landscape. And what was really interesting and why I realized the search engine is so important is not that they found particular websites way more often, like the commercial portals, compared to the NGOs or more the alternative medical information. Of course, that was ranked way further down. So in terms of that, it's a powerful tool already. But also what I found is that people really create different ways of evaluating the information. So what they said, for example, is, I can't even remember what website it was. It was on the third. It was the third position. And then they go to a website, and then they go back to Google, and it's sort of their signpost almost through the web. And what they made is actually they made their own factors of evaluation. So they said, well, this information was recurring 5 times now, so now I'm thinking it must be right in a way. So it's way more comparison that is taking place rather than thinking, well, this is a hospital website. That needs to be accurate information because that's what the providers told me. They think, well, I have this sort of quality of my information just because, or I can signal the quality of my information through my name or my institution and things like that, but people never entered the homepage. They just entered the website from the side where whatever subpage the search engine offers. Oftentimes it's not even very visibly clear what kind of provider that is. So oftentimes, and they don't go to the homepage, they just read the information, go back to Google, read the next website. So it crystallizes, quality is something that crystallizes throughout this process. So it's really also having epistemic implications, how we go about filtering information and accessing information. And so I think the search engine in terms of knowledge is huge, not in terms of data protection, most importantly, this is one aspect. But I think in giving us access to knowledge, it's crucial. For me, it's way more important than social media because, of course, I can sideline social media, but I need to get around the information somehow, and all the information is online now, and everyone is using it, even people that don't heavily usually use internet technologies, but they have to get their information from somewhere, and then they're directed to the web, like from all kinds of institutions. It's all out there online now. It's not that these people provide their leaflets anymore. So I think in terms of knowledge creation and access to knowledge, and also evaluating knowledge, the search engine is really crucial. And it's one company that is doing all that for us now. And it's a corporate one. I mean, this is sort of troubling, I think. And it's, as I said, it's not only the ranking that is important, but it's really also the way the information is provided. It's very decontextualized, actually. The user has to make sense of it herself, because you only get these bits and pieces of information, and then you go back, you don't read the whole context of the website in a way. The search engine deconstructs the information very much that the website providers put together as a package in a way. So it does a lot. It's very active. It's not a passive mediator between these two groups of people and the advertisers, but it's really changing the information.
Selecting and
yeah. And it always gives you the small portion of text. That is
then
on
maybe
a
we have to
particular
create
subject.
more small portions of text which are confusing for the machines in search engines, and then having a diversity of the things. You know, this is if we are not really able to access that, or the algorithms, and transparency, and we don't know why certain things are found and why certain things are not found.
And it's not only the search engine, it's a dynamics around that. When I was in Sweden, I did another sideline project with a colleague of mine. She was doing research on biofuels, and we did a media analysis of Swedish press materials and the Google search result analysis. And what we found is that, of course, providers are strategically using the search engine now. So it's also their practices that are getting adapted to the search engine. So it's, of course, Google usually says, or right at the beginning, it said, we're doing nothing. We're just taking the intelligence out there and showing that in a rank. But now the people are adapting their practices to the technology. So it's not that the intelligence is out there anymore, but it's the rather more actors with more resources or with more know-how, whatever, that get to the top. It's not that people are just putting out their links anymore, as it was maybe at the beginning when the search engine was not so important. But since it's this monopoly now, everyone is adapting their practices to this one particular search engine. If you have something to sell and you're not on the first page, you can close your business, basically. There's no way of being found. So it's not,
You are
the argument doesn't hold true. The argument doesn't hold true anymore that they say we just use the link structures that are out there and then transform them, which was the case when they started, but now with their power. So in terms of all that, I'm still thinking search engines are quite, powerful.
I think on that note,
Yes.
so we're
We
not
should-
all get very
Yes.
depressed.
Close the
I would like to
discussion.
thank you very
Yes.
much for
Yes.
being
Thank
here.
you.
And we can continue the discussion about why we should. Thank you.
Thank you a lot.